It's amazing to be here. I think it's my favourite thing in the world to be in a room of youth workers and people who support and love youth work in your various ways. And it's been amazing to meet some of you, and I hope to meet other people throughout the day. Thank you so much for having me with you. I'm really looking forward to learning and engaging with you throughout this day and visioning and dreaming about youth work and what it might be. So thank you so much for the introduction. I'll briefly just mention the structure of what I'm going to talk about today. When I reflected on transformative youth work and visioning, the three themes that came up for me were celebrating, reflecting, and resisting. Celebrating the work that goes on as youth workers, but also critically celebrating and thinking about the policy framework that we work in and some of the barriers. Reflecting, and within that, thinking about evaluation, some of which does not always encourage reflection and some of which might do, and again thinking about policy and practice. And resisting, are there spaces for resistance and collective action within youth work? And I know that we'll be going on to discuss some of this throughout the day, both informally in the breaks and in the afternoon. Katie's really effectively introduced me already, so I guess all I'll say is that I came into youth work through being a young person who was struggling with a lot of things, both structural issues, growing up in an economically disadvantaged family, having other sort of health challenges and caring challenges as a young person. And I think I desired youth work before I even found it. I grew up in an area where there wasn't much youth work. And when I found a youth group and also some volunteering, it was really powerful for me. And I became a youth worker through volunteering. I had never planned to become a youth worker. It wasn't something I knew existed. And I'm seeing some nods in the room. Maybe some people have a similar experience. I was also an activist when I was young, taking action on environmental issues and various kind of social justice issues. And it took a while before I managed to start to integrate those two things, the youth work and the political activism. And I guess it's still a struggle. It's still something I'm thinking about. And as Katie said, I was a youth worker for 20 years before working in the university. And I can't believe it's now been 9 years that I've worked at King's College London since my PhD. The reason I can't believe it is I didn't go to university at all till I was 30. So it wasn't kind of again, it wasn't something that I expected to happen in my life. It's especially amazing to be here at York University and at YouthREX, because I feel like there's a lot of synergies between our work, and I'm already learning so much here. So I want to start with celebrating, and today I'm drawing on two studies that I've done, and I will explain a bit more about them shortly. But what I love doing is thinking with the words and voices of young people and youth workers. So there's a lot of quotations in this presentation that I'll probably mostly read out just to give us, even though you can read them yourself, but I probably will read them out because it gives us time to dwell with those words. And Nevaeh, I'll start with Nevaeh, who is a young person and a youth work volunteer who I spoke with in 2013. And Nevaeh said, I love youth work. I literally spend the evening going from group to group, chatting to people, anything they want to talk about. I think the face-to-face time is what keeps you real. It's what keeps you wanting to do it. And I'm a big believer in celebrating what we do as youth workers, especially that face-to-face time. I still say we, even though mostly I'm not a youth worker now, but I do volunteer on a Friday night in a very small grassroots youth club in the town where I live. So I'm still going to keep the we. What do I mean by youth work, though? I think most people in this room are probably youth workers or work in youth work, but as you'll know, youth work has very blurry boundaries and we don't all mean the same thing when we say youth work. So I hope this talk resonates whatever kinds of youth work you're engaged with and committed to. But to situate myself, my main experience and the focus of my research is mainly on what we call in the UK and Europe I don't know if here as well, open youth work. And I'll define open youth work as having three key features. First of all, that is about spaces for informal education. Informal education, what's that? Well, we learn informally anyway. I mean, all of us do as humans, through conversation, through activities, through relationships with others, those opportunities outside of formal classroom settings where we're learning. And by informal education, I mean that it's where people, it might be youth workers, it might be young people themselves in youth-led projects, are deliberately setting out those spaces in a way that informal learning is likely to occur, but it's not imposed. You don't have to learn, but we're going to set up a space where there's a likelihood, there's a support for that. The second feature of open youth work is that it's open for young people to get involved by choice. So there are forms of work with young people, of course, where they're targeted at a specific group, where they've been referred to something, where maybe they are incarcerated or they're in school or they're somewhere they have to be, and there's youth workers working with them there. And I'm sure it's better to have youth workers in those situations than to not have youth workers. But what open youth work is, and it's something that I think is important to defend the spaces of open youth work as well. Open youth work is where young people have made that choice. They have decided to come, and actually they can go when they want without any sanction whatsoever. We sometimes call it the voluntary principle, building on work by many people, Bernard Davies, Tony Jeffs, Mark Smith, and others. And the third feature of open youth work is that it's open-ended. And what I mean by that is open-ended in its timescale. It's not just a 6-week program. It's something where you can maybe come and go over many years, or maybe you just engage for a while and then, and that's it for then. It's open-ended in its content or activity. So maybe it has a focus on youth arts or sports, or maybe it has lots of activities. But it's not just you come here to do one thing. There's a freedom. You can do a bit of this, you can sit out of it for a while, you don't have to do that. And it's also open in its intended outcomes. That doesn't mean we don't care, anything goes, it doesn't matter, but it means that young people have that freedom to an autonomy. And I guess there's an improvisational aspect where we're not going there to get a particular thing usually. We'll see. Let's co-construct that together. Let's work it out as we go on. And yeah, things might come out of it, but we're not prescribing that in advance. I think and hope that these practices are aligned with other practices or other names of practices, critical positive youth development. I know you use that term in YouthREX, and I'm happy to see the word critical there. Community spaces, after school, youth action, youth organising, youth-led practices, I think all have something in common. I guess the bulk of open youth work in the UK context would be youth clubs, community centres where young people come for certain times, detached or street-based youth work. Do you use that term, detached youth work? No, is that maybe not used here? So detached work would be street-based youth work, working on young people's territory on their terms, rather than expecting them to come to us. We'll be where they are, where they're hanging out. And online youth work, where it's got those open aspects as well. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. And to illustrate that, I'll draw on a couple of quotations from two young people who I worked with as young people and then collaborated with in a youth workers cooperative as youth workers. They were young youth workers alongside, and we also co-wrote a chapter of the book that Katie mentioned together. And Keyshawn, talking about youth work, Keyshawn Deckle-Dover-Johnson said, youth work is about being allowed to choose whether you just want to sit in a corner with your friend on your phone and just sit there, do nothing all day, or whether you want to get involved, talk to the workers, start planning. You're allowed to have your own mind. You're not forced to go to one place and you have to act like everyone else. I really love what Keyshawn says here, because it's kind of celebrating not just the visible planning or getting involved or youth participation. It is celebrating that, but it's also celebrating you might have times when you're doing nothing much. And where do we get to do nothing much? Where does that happen? For youth workers too, for adults too, where does that happen, where we get a break from the kind of production and consumption, and we've got to be doing things and contributing to capitalism and so on in those ways? Where do you get to just do nothing? So I do think it shouldn't be a radical thing, but it kind of is. And Ananina Kodua said, YouthWork's a free space. It's not like school where you have to go and do set things. It's more relaxed, I guess. And there's more of a relationship between the young people and the youth workers. I can't explain it. It's quite spontaneous. Like you can kind of drop your worries-ish, if that makes sense. Just come here and do something fun, chat with your friends and have a debate. And again, I love Ananina's words so much, which I think are extremely articulate, explaining about the relationship, the freedom, the relax, the dropping your worries, doing something fun. And I also love, I can't explain it. And I love ish. It resonates with me that youth work is difficult to explain. And while sometimes we're tempted to systematize it and make it easier to explain and set the outcomes and set the logic models and all those things that can be useful and can be needed for funders or for ourselves as well, sometimes for young people, sometimes let's just sit with that. I can't explain it. What's going on here? It's hard to explain. I think that's okay. As I said, I'll draw today on two studies. So the first one a little bit less so, but the one I've quoted from already is Grassroots Youth Work, which is the one that the book is about. And that was my PhD study, which was looking at how part-time and volunteer youth workers experienced a changing policy context. And I'll speak more about that policy context shortly. To briefly summarize the findings, it was a 3-year qualitative and collaborative study. The part-time and volunteer youth workers in the study, who were all based in England, by the way. So again, does this resonate? How much does it resonate? Where are the differences? The part-time and volunteer youth workers were passionately committed and emphasised their genuine care for the young people they work with. Well, okay, does that just sound obvious? Maybe, but it was kind of a striking finding because I've been going in at a time that was very difficult for youth workers, motivated it by my own experience of the challenges, of the tensions, of the shutting down of projects, the closure of projects, the redundancies that were going on at that time, and then by the other policies that were affecting the work of the youth workers who were still able to practice. And so when I asked youth workers what they liked and didn't like about their work, and I kept the questions very open like that, what do you like about your work? What don't you like about your work? The passion in their eyes and in their language, and they all used the word love. Nearly every youth worker used the word love without prompting. And I thought that was really worth celebrating. Secondly, they really wanted to be involved in decisions made about their work. So part-time and volunteer youth workers, I don't know if this is similar here, but certainly at the time of the study and still to an extent now, the bulk of the face-to-face youth work would be done by people on bad contracts, on part-time hours, often on very insecure contracts, sometimes made to work self-employed, although they weren't really self-employed, they didn't have that autonomy, and often not really properly involved and engaged in their organisations. This didn't always happen. Some organisations were great at involving their youth workers, their grassroots youth workers. And these were the workers who were disproportionately from the communities that they served or from similar communities, who had lived experience of the issues that they were working with the young people on. So even more so, it was problematic that they were in this position of being marginalised economically and in terms of security, but also in terms of decisions made about their work. They were the ones working with the young people, but often felt like we're not really consulted. These changes just happened to us and we don't know what happened. It was especially the case with workers in larger organisations and in local government youth services, but sometimes in small organisations too, sadly. Thirdly, they really wanted to work alongside experienced, supportive senior colleagues. Some of them were very experienced themselves, and many of them were newer, had been there a few years, and they loved working alongside experienced colleagues. But what they found was that sometimes their senior colleagues were not experienced youth workers, but had come from outside, come from business, because they had those business skills that were now needed in this new policy context. And fourthly, there were a few things they were critical of, but the main one that came up again and again and again was target cultures and bureaucracy in their work, which I'll speak more about through the presentation, because that really inspired my second study as well. I want to speak about the policy context. When I was doing this study, 2011 to 14, we were in a time of austerity after the financial crash in 2008, where there were many cuts to youth work in England. And again, I don't know if you had the same situation here, but money was short. However, the policy context the youth workers were experiencing wasn't as simple as that. It was really rooted in 30 years of neoliberalism, really starting in the late 70s, the election of Margaret Thatcher, if you hear that name, in the UK, and Ronald Reagan, who were really sort of amongst the instigators of neoliberalism. But neoliberalism, by which I mean the global dominance of big business, the privatization of public and voluntary services, or sometimes a sort of quasi-privatization, and also to an extent the privatization of everyday life, where even those of us who may be critical of neoliberalism or may just think, don't really care, I've got no time for politics, whether we like it or not, it seeps into our everyday life, our everyday ways of being, and it's more or less impossible to absent ourselves from that, even if we're also resisting it. But I have put 1990s to 2010s there because in England, neoliberalism really seeped more firmly into youth work from the 90s when we had a centre-left government elected, Tony Blair's New Labour, if you've heard of that. And that government put money into youth work, which was great. We hadn't had good investment for some time by then. They put money into youth work. Fantastic. However, that was contingent on a huge amount of central control. And just briefly, some of the what we'd call policy technologies that work together to change youth work in a neoliberal form at that time were those that I've bullet pointed there. Marketisation. So marketisation would be about the youth landscape working like a market, that we've got an atmosphere of scarcity, even in times of plenty, when more money was being put in, competition was encouraged. You need to compete with each other. You organizations don't cooperate, compete. And you rather than going for grants on the basis of community need, it would more be a top-down thing where government or other large organizations would say, we're going to tender, do you want to do this service or not? So it's coming top-down rather than bottom-up. Managerialism. So that would be about bringing private sector managerial expertise into the community and youth sector. Again, things like a lot of managers suddenly. I mean, the last organization I worked for as an employed youth worker, lovely organization. They had lots and lots of good things about them, but there were more managers than youth workers, and nothing against those people, but what's happened when we're here for the young people, but it's so lopsided that even numbers-wise there's more managers, and never mind money-wise, because you know those youth workers are not getting paid what those managers are getting paid. What's happened there? But also the ways of measuring were managerial too, and we'll come onto that more. Securitization and policing. So that's really about how young people were increasingly controlled through those years in terms of, and I won't go into it in detail, but in terms of how they were constrained from using public spaces, they were watched, there was increasing surveillance. And really sadly, and I can't think of the word, but angry-makingly as well as sadly, the youth workers were brought into that against our will, and some of us resisted it, but we were compelled to work with police, for example, work alongside police, whereas naturally most of the young people we worked with did not trust police, had very bad experiences, family bad experiences. So to work with police was seen as not right by many of us, and some of us refused to, but general securitization as well, data sharing. You're going to collect this data on these young people, you're going to pass it to the authorities. Very big change. And alongside all of this, an undervaluing and a tax really on grassroots practices, the open youth work that I've been speaking about, all disproportionately affecting, of course, low-income communities, minoritized communities, marginalized communities. This really changed what it meant to be a youth worker, and a part-time youth worker, Mickey, said, it's not as much my organisation being able to say, yeah, that's really good work, and actually this is quality work. It's a numbers game, and we have to meet what the funders' expectations are. I'm conflicted about it. I always try and make sure my work is, young people have ownership of it, and they have options, and they choose things. Sometimes that isn't the case, and I'm aware of that. So that dilemma came through really strongly from that grassroots youth work study. I'm going to mention the second study now, which is the one that I've undertaken with Louise Doherty over the last few years. It was a 3.5-year study in partnership with youth organisations in England. And it was really inspired by the youth workers who were part of the first study and their identification of this central issue around targets and outcomes coming into their work in a way that they found problematic. And at the same time, it was also inspired by a growing, what we call a youth impact agenda. And what we meant by a youth impact agenda is a growing dominance of the view that youth organisations and any organisations need to measure their impact, they need to predefine their outcomes, they need to clearly measure them, preferably using quantitative techniques, preferably using validated psychology tools. And the sense to which it's an agenda, what I meant by that is that it was a dominant view by big funders, by government, by influential youth sector organisations. And that agenda's changed over the years a bit, and it has become more flexible. But we wanted to investigate if and how it was shaping practice. And we especially wanted to understand the perspectives of young people and frontline youth workers, but also managers, funders, policymakers in relation to this, and consider what might be more appropriate ways of evaluating. And I was really, when I came across YouthREX's work in this area, the Beyond Measure report, if people have been part of it or if people haven't seen it, it's really fantastic, and I can see a lot of resonances there with our work. These are these anonymised organisations that we mainly worked with on this study, 8 organisations across England, and we wanted to balance representation of a diversity of organisations with the idea of working in depth with these organisations, so being there, spending a lot of time with them, just being part of the youth work, not just going in and asking questions, although we did also interviews and focus groups and some youth participatory research as part of it. So it included smaller youth clubs, larger youth services, multi-agency provision, urban, rural, coastal work, charities, social enterprises, local governments, and then a real range of approaches to youth work too. So I'm still in the sort of celebration theme here. So although the focus of the study is on evaluation, I'll talk about that shortly. But in order to think about evaluation, we wanted to understand more, how do youth workers and young people see the value of youth work? Let's not assume what that value should be or what we're even evaluating, but what is this work? And young people highly valued youth work in their relationships with youth workers. They were really articulate in expressing this. And here's a couple of young people's quotes. Tracy, who's in a small youth club in a southwest England town, said it's quite freeing in a way, because you know that there's always someone to talk to about things that you might not want to broach with your parents and friends and something. And you know that you've got a place to go that's just sort of completely separate from everyday life. So if you're having a bad day, you know, you can sort of leave it all behind and just have just a 2-hour break from just anything that's bothering you. And it makes you feel free about things. And Aurora, who was in a London youth club, said, I guess it's like a bridge between all the different ages. So at school, you have like different years, depending on your ages. And in youth club, it's like from 11 to 19 years old, all in one space, like socializing, which you wouldn't normally have at school. So it's like something different. So youth work in the UK works with various different age groups, but 11 to 19 would be a typical age range, sometimes working with older young people as well, young adults. We heard such an abundance of reflections from young people on the value of youth work and the value of their relationships with youth workers. And what it really encapsulated was the sense of agency, freedom, safety, sociability, support, joy sometimes, that so many young people experienced across youth work settings. One of the participatory elements of the study was a film project where young people made a film, and we'll probably see a short excerpt from it later. So I won't speak too much about that right now. But what they really wanted to do, what I was going to say is what they really wanted to do is focus on the value of youth work. So it was inspired by some of the findings from the research. And they took that and then they were like, you know what? Evaluation, that's fine, but it's a bit boring to talk about. We want to celebrate youth work. We just want to celebrate what we like about youth work. But I'll go on to reflecting now from celebrating. And critical reflection on practice for me is one of the key cornerstones of youth work, as you'll know. It's what makes it a profession, it's what makes it a craft in some ways, maybe even an art, as Kerry Young would suggest. And beyond that is what supports us in developing as anti-oppressive practitioners and organisations that reflection on what we do, not assuming that what we do is sort of good somehow or something like this. And in this section, I'll share more quotations from youth workers and young people from that Rethinking Impact study. So we wanted to know, how is youth work evaluated? There's not one unitary way, there's many different ways. What are young people's and youth workers' experiences of it? And these were some of the sort of more positive experiences where youth workers felt they were centering reflective practice in their evaluation. So Corey said, this isn't always what young people most want to do. Some young people, when we ask them those very reflective questions, are quite aware of, oh, you're going to make me answer those damn questions. There was an element of humour, though, in how he put it across. For me, he said it's good to know that they know that we're kind of stretching their thinking and helping them critique things. So engaging the young people themselves in reflective practice. Zane, who's a youth worker at a trans youth organisation, said that they undertook a very creative evaluation. And actually, it was a sheet of paper and it had 3 questions. The young people were part of designing the questions. They could just circle a number or they could say a bit more. But the way that the youth workers implemented that evaluation was different every time. They sometimes had group discussions. They did it creatively. And the questions, Zane said, are specific to what young people might be feeling or going through, but also that we create space for those conversations to take place. And then youth workers in a focus group in the Southwest said, it's all really sensible. It's not like over-the-top council-esque super paperwork that kills us all off and takes the spark out of it. And you can tell from that they've had some different experiences of evaluation that maybe were not so positive. As you might expect, there was a real broad range of views on evaluation and impact measurement in the settings we visited, and really a broad range of experiences. But one thing that came through is how there's a lot we do as youth workers that's hard to evaluate, that's hard to count, I guess. And so we'll hear from Nicole, a youth worker in a London youth club. Nicole said, I think it's just difficult to show exactly what growth in each person looks like. I mean, the enjoyable things about youth work are like the small things. So I made lasagna last week with the junior youth club. We made it earlier in the day and then we ate it later on in the house meeting. 3 young people were like, nah, I don't like this. I don't like cheese. I don't eat this. I don't eat this. But 3 of them tried it who wouldn't have normally because the younger ones had made it. And those small things are big. The thing was, how do I record that? I know that trying lasagna to other people isn't big. I thought it is big for these young people. Like, it is big. And I guess your knowledge of the young people is like how you know whether they're changing or growing. But that's really hard to write down sometimes, or really hard to reflect to funders. I'm seeing some nods in the room. And it's interesting. And you would have to really be embedded in that organisation or that house meeting or with those young people to know. Because in another youth club, that wouldn't be big. It would be like eating lasagna. What's that? So Nicole clearly identifies here the nuanced ways that young people and youth workers respond to apparently simple activities like cooking, both immediately in the moment and over time. Observing those small developments as significant and might be perceived as meaningless or silly or simply sort of not notable by others. And here the depth of reflective practice is arguably intrinsically evaluative. Despite this, Nicole expresses sort of discomfort, frustration, and almost embarrassment maybe at how to locate this eating lasagna as an evaluated outcome maybe. The pressure of trying to fit in with the prescribed discourse or the dominant discourse of what might be quantifiable, what might be accepted as evaluative evidence. And for Nicole, there's something important in this lasagna story, which perhaps could be more explored, perhaps needs more exploration through dialogue with other youth workers, with the young people themselves, with community members. Perhaps it's not enough, perhaps it's enough sometimes, but perhaps it's not always enough just to say they didn't try cheese and then they did try cheese or something. We'd need a bit of context there. But, you know, is there room for that? Is there room to celebrate those things? So what's the problem with that? I'm going to come back to policy here again, how policy has shaped youth work evaluation in England. And again, I'm really curious to know how much this resonates in your settings. I'm aware there are people watching online as well who may be in a variety of contexts. I don't know, maybe we have guests here from England and other places. But does this make sense to you? So in our recent article, Capturing the Magic, my colleague Louise Doherty and I argue that evaluation in youth work is shaped by three broad interlinking policy agendas. One of them is a decade we've now had of cuts. And in England, the effects of this are stark and ongoing, and they're really disproportionately felt as well in different areas. They particularly affect low-income communities, working class communities, ethnically minoritized and rural youth services as well. And also, like any group that is generally struggling in the time today and is disproportionately affected by neoliberalism, more likely to lose their youth services. So local authority spending on youth work in England in 2018 was almost 70% lower than it was in 2010. So that's devastating. And even though there's now a bit of government funding of youth work in England, it doesn't go anywhere near even halfway to replacing what was lost. We've also lost something more long-term, and that's the building up over years and decades of expertise and experience. And buildings have been sold off, for example, that are never going to be bought back again. Austerity here, the cutting of services, acted as a rationale for evaluation, and that was quite interesting. So organisations and youth workers at this time were told, right, money's tight, so even more important to evaluate your practice, measure what you do, provide a stronger justification of both the value of youth work generally, but your organisation, what are you doing that's innovative? What are you doing? And that kind of does sound like it makes sense. It's got a certain internal logic to it, but it's problematic because it assumes that austerity is okay, and it assumes that competing our way out of it is going to be the answer. And it also neglects that these cuts were a massive impediment to evaluation. When we're better funded, when we feel our job is secure, that's when we might be more likely to be able to really think carefully about what we're doing and what young people are getting out of it. We might not, we can't assume that, but we might have more space to do that. The cuts reduced staff time, and they also created an atmosphere of insecurity and competition between organisations. It's difficult to be honest in those situations of what maybe hasn't quite worked, and it's difficult to cooperate with others. So the second closely linked policy area that we identify as affecting evaluation, shaping evaluation, is what we call the youth impact agenda. And that felt more international. So it is interesting to see what's happening here. And I have mentioned what I mean by that, the broad agreement amongst influential individuals and organisations that everyone needs to measure their impact. Again, it sounds quite common sense. Why wouldn't you want to know the impact of what you're doing? But there are problems there. And I think youth work is somewhere where those problems are quite a bit easier to see. And this preference for measurement is partly incentivized in policy by the third policy agenda that influences evaluation in youth work, and that's decision making based on social value or social return on investment. Are you familiar with these terms? Does it affect your work? Some nods in the room. So in the UK, we have Treasury-led policies. Is that your finance minister? So the Treasury in the UK, who look after the finances, they have a huge amount of power where the youth department in the UK or the education department in the government would put forward certain proposals. But if you want spending, you need to show using calculations, using formulas, how that is going to create value in monetary terms. And I've written about this with colleagues in Birmingham and in London, Ian Magimsey and John Owen, about how this has created a kind of social investment machine that creates new experimental ways of calculating financial impact that requires a large infrastructure of outcome measurement. And the results are seen in evaluation reports now, where youth workers and youth organisations increasingly feel we need to prove monetary value, and we need to show you invest £1, you get £3.21 back, and it's always got to be very specific and sound like it's very, whereas actually there's lots of kind of assumptions and guesswork built in there as well. So these three agendas are quite mutually reinforcing, and they do bring with them challenges for young people and for practitioners. And I'm not saying it's all bad, but I do think it's worth thinking through the problems, because we're being encouraged to think, all this stuff's just what we need to do now, it's all good. So it's through our research interviews and in our informal conversations and spending time in youth organisations, we found that many young people were aware of these pressures, acutely aware, and they were aware that if that evaluation really linked to work, was their organisation going to survive, was their youth club going to stay open? But they did question them as well and felt that too much evaluation was really inappropriate. So Jasmine, a young person in a London youth club, said, that's what school is for. The thing here in the youth club is outside. You come to play pool or whatever. You don't come here to fill forms, It's like, I'm not going there if they're going to make me fill forms. We found this quote striking in its context, especially coming from a young woman who wasn't just there playing pool. She was a full part of the life and the leadership of her youth club. She was very engaged. She would have had outcomes coming out of her ears from this youth club. But that's not how she wanted to see the youth club. She didn't want to be filling in a form. And the only other thing she said would stop her coming to youth club is if police started coming in the youth club again. She said, I'm out of there. I'm not staying if that happens. And that was really interesting. Another main theme coming from young people was around the sensitivity of being asked questions around things like that, again, adults or researchers or people might see as unproblematic, like we want to know about your well-being, or we want to know about your happiness or self-esteem, and again, I can see that in YouthREX and in Ontario, you think a lot about these things and how to ask these questions. Young people were saying that some questions could be triggering or intrusive. And Luna, a young person in a coastal youth club, said some days you don't really want to think about that question, and it can make you think too far into it. And then you can be left thinking about it for the rest of the day. Sometimes the things that it says on those questionnaires can actually give you ideas instead of helping you. And again, Luna was a really committed member of her youth club, a really regular member. Mental health was a key theme in that youth club, and she was experiencing mental health issues herself. And so really from that, she was relating to questions she'd been asked in her mental health support that was structured. And then where she felt she got more mental health support, or it felt more useful to her, was in her youth club, where they weren't yet having to ask all these sensitive questions. Overall, young people felt quite ambivalent about impact measurement in youth work, and some felt it shouldn't be necessary at all. In particular, young people challenged intrusive, insensitive, or labelling kinds of questions. And some of this came about in more, again, what might be seen as neutral monitoring questions. And again, I really love the work of YouthREX on things like the questioning around gender and how to do that in a more inclusive way. So important. Sabian, a young person from a trans youth organisation, said it's invasive. I mean, I get that question a lot. And Sabian here is talking about questions mainly outside of the youth club. Do you have a disability? And maybe you do, but you don't want to disclose that, Questions can be asked that are a bit much, but then they should give you an option to be like, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to. And Sabian really valued that at their youth club, they did not have to answer any questions. They never had to answer any questions they didn't want to. And this was generally the case in most youth work settings. But we'd question, how much is it a choice when you're asked, you don't have to, when you're told you don't have to, if you also know that your organisation needs that funding? So Sabian went on to say, someone asked my youth club manager, Ira, if this was going to give Journeys more money if we fill out this form. And he said, probably. And they were like, right, give it to me. Because they were like, this youth group means so much to me. I have to do it, And again, I'm seeing a couple of nods in the room. And I've been there as a youth worker where you do kind of want someone to fill out that form for you or do something for you. And I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong, because it's part of sharing honestly what your context is. But how much is it really a choice? And how much do young people feel they can kind of resist being put into those boxes they didn't want to be put in? There were challenges for youth workers here too. Certain approaches to evaluation could feel really meaningless, not youth-centred, and it really contrasted with the reflective and anti-oppressive approaches that most of them wanted to take to their work. So Mel, a street-based youth worker from London, reflected what some of the young people were saying. Young people don't want to fill out paper. They are like, why are we doing this? Dawn, a youth worker, said, so the council database is like a swear word in the youth work world. You're going to put them on this ridiculous database that takes effing ages and use a lot of your capacity, which could be working with young people. And Nora was recollecting past experiences of very heavy evaluation in a place where she'd worked and said, it used to take up a really long time. It would be frustrating. You wouldn't be able to do your youth work. You'd be trying to evidence youth work that you didn't have time to do. So a bit like where you ended up with lots of managers and very few youth workers proportionately. It felt to some youth workers that they were doing a bit more evaluation than they were doing face-to-face youth work. Time feels like a key factor here. And it didn't mean youth workers didn't want to spend time on evaluation. They did. It's more that they wanted it to support their work, not take away from it and not make it more hostile for young people. There were positive experiences too. So a couple from young people. Delilah was talking about her youth worker, Dawn, and said, Dawn was up there. She was like, what did you get out of this? What did you get out of that? And how can we improve it for next year? Blah, 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 blah. And it was great. And I feel like me, just in general, I get interviewed quite a lot at my youth club, which I love because it's great. And she was great too. And Chloe also really engaged in the life of her youth club, a really sort of, I think she'd say herself a shy young woman. And she said, it's either rating from 1 to 10, then if it's like comments or how it's helped you recently, it's just nice to explain how it's helped. But even without questions a few times, I've wrote how it's helped. And I've even wrote like 2 pages and they've given it to the funding to show how much it's affected me. I'm really proud of it. Her project really worked flexibly. They had funding where they had to show certain outcomes, but they were able to devise those with the young people, and they were able to work with the young people to decide how should we evaluate this time. So this is kind of a sum up of some of the challenges that we encountered. That evaluation was often challenging. It was sometimes overwhelming for organisations as well as youth workers and young people themselves, just that demand. So however much, youth workers differed in how committed they were to impact measurement, what they felt about it, and evaluation more broadly. But having to navigate the multiple demands of different funders who often needed completely different things or in a different format or wanted a slightly different age group or suddenly wanted you to work in a particular neighbourhood that you weren't already working in, and you could suddenly have loads of money, but only if you did this ridiculous amount of admin, really could be intrusive and triggering. We've spoken about it wasn't always clear what the point was. So for youth workers, they felt they'd been sold this idea that if you evaluate really well, if you prove your impact, then you will get funding. Didn't always happen. They might be proving their impact really well, but they didn't necessarily get the funding. And it didn't feel like that link was as clear as it had been sold to them. And it wasn't always clear who it was for or where it went. Whose benefit is this? It would be justified as this is for the young people's benefit, but did that really happen? So I'm going to move on to the third, final, shorter theme you'll be glad to hear, of resistance, and just think about not just on evaluation, but in general in youth work. Do we resist? Is there a role for resistance around things that we disagree with about the context of our work? In our Rethinking Impact study, we asked young people and youth workers, how could policy better support youth work? And so a few quotes on that. Yvonne said, there's got to be more funding put into it. I think that's a massive thing. There's been that many cuts across the board. I mean, youth service alone is like non-existent or very reduced or becoming very targeted. I think there needs to be more opportunities for these smaller grassroots where you've got the projects, but they're probably not bringing in a lot of money. Isaac, a young person, was a bit more blunt. Stop cutting our bloody funding, thank you. And Joel, a volunteer, was talking about how can youth work then be accountable to its funders? It's understandable they want to know how their money's being spent. And Joel said, get from behind your desk and computer screen and come and look at it yourself. And then you'll realise that actually it has a massive impact on the lives of young people. And so there is something here about youth workers and young people, at least when they're asked, being outspoken in stating their support for funding, for support for youth work in policy, for relationships between funders and youth workers. But were they able to take action? Could they resist what they felt were unjust systems and policies and practice decisions? And can or should resistance be about broader social and societal issues too, even when this might come into conflict with funding? Can we really claim youth work's always a good thing as well? So is defending funding for youth work, that can be a bit complex. And I really draw on the work, several people's work here, but I'm especially inspired by Bianca Baldridge's work, which I really recommend. And one of Bianca's recent articles is the youth work paradox. And it's about how youth work is a potential site of liberation, but it's also a site of containment and fixing. And Bianca Baldridge is particularly thinking about work with Black young people. And I think this is really important when we're defending youth work, when we're calling for funding, to remember that, fine, but we can't romanticize what we do. That is always and only good. We can be part of the system too, in damaging ways. And similarly, is there an evaluation paradox? We were wondering in our study, is there a parallel evaluation paradox where evaluation can be fantastic? It can give us space for critical reflection on practice. It can centre young people's perspectives. It can be about community accountability. It can be about accountability to each other as youth workers, to our practice, our profession. But it can also mean surveillance, it can be reductive, it can reduce young people down to numbers or to specific outcomes. It can be disciplining, showing we need you to do this, to follow the line, to toe the line, to behave better, and so on. It can narrow what counts as good practice. It can reconfigure what kinds of works are funded and what are not. The most easily measurable programs are going to find it easier to find funding in this current context. So I won't say too much more, but just to go back to the PhD study, where I did look at resistance, just because it did come out from the accounts of the part-time youth workers there a decade ago. Only a few of them were involved in activism and mostly defending youth work, and some of them were really thinking critically about what kind of youth work is it we're defending. More were involved in what Stephen Ball and others would call everyday resistance to everyday power, drawing on Foucault. And some of the forms of everyday resistance that came up in that study were counter discourses, so pointing out like the contradictions and the limitations inherent in what we are taking for granted. And that might mean doing what we need to do in terms of maybe to keep our project open and to keep being able to practice, we need to do some things we're uncomfortable with, but we're not going to do all of them, and we're going to also speak out. Resistance and rebellion, refusals, resisting, refusing damaging contracts and requirements, and also creating alternatives, maybe new organisations or new ways of working within our existing organisations. So just a quote on each one. Laura, part-time youth worker, worked for an organisation that was quite target focused, and was asked to show what opportunities we give young people. I gave a few examples of concrete things we give them, very concrete, tangible things. And then I said, but the most important things are the things you can't touch. And I made a massive emphasis on that because they're so obsessed with bloody targets. And then I sort of made from the concrete ones, which untangible ones come out of that. And then some comments from young people. So even in a situation where Laura and her colleagues and the young people felt their funding was very precarious, so they had to show what they were being asked to show, they felt, but they're also going to say, you know, this isn't everything, right? You know, there's more to it than this. In terms of refusals and rebellion, Mickey worked for an LGBTQ plus youth organisation, and it was funded by the local authority that at that time required them to put young people's details in a shared database that went across tens of thousands of people working in various different education and young people services. So Mickey's organisation objected to this. It would risk outing the young people, but just in general, they also didn't believe in young people's information as a currency for funding. The young people made a campaign, Mickey said, and we supported that. I think it's about an ethos and a principle of respecting young people's details, not seeing their information as currency to get funding. The staff and volunteers are not threatened and not going to be pushed over. You're threatening my job doesn't make my principles or the principles of this place any different. I think it's partly just because of the kind of general vibe of the place, but also there was a lot of support from a lot of people. And I think that last is important, that Mickey's organisation was well established, had wider community links amongst the LGBTQ+ community. It wasn't just those youth workers speaking out. Their organisation had a history of political engagement and solidarity with others as well. So they were successful in resisting that policy and keeping their funding. And then we had several youth workers who were setting up new small organisations. And in policy, that was often positioned as entrepreneurship, which, you know, again, is one of those terms that can be positive, but can also use the language of the market and celebrate that. But the youth workers themselves were seeing their visionary new organisations as something different, as a form of resistance against the non-profit industrial complex, as Black and minoritized activists have called it. And Kieran said, because we see these things all the time and we see so much bad practice, we want to show that there can be a good organisation there that really cares about young people. We're not all about, you know, money and targets like other organisations are. And authenticity was really key to these youth workers. So I'll finish this presentation just reflecting on the politics of youth work and evaluation. Just thinking that if we think together about the conditions needed to support youth work, because that's often the reason we're asked to do a lot of this impact measurement, which, like I say, isn't always negative, but it's often the justification of we need youth work to be, you know, to be better, we need anti-oppressive youth work, it helps us with our practice, yes. But if we think the other way around, what conditions would enable this practice to thrive? Really, first of all, it's investment, it's long-term investment, and it's long-term investment in youth work's core costs. And without this, young people won't be able to rely on services, workers won't be able to rely on jobs, on secure jobs, and people will continue to leave the work. Secondly, we need funders and resource providers to build trusting relationships with youth organisations and to work to earn and maintain that trust. So it's not just going one way where the youth organisations have constantly got to prove that they're doing something. Thirdly, we need to recenter critically reflective practice at the core of our youth work expertise and reclaim this reflective practice as a form of evaluation, because it often isn't seen as such. It's seen as, oh yeah, that's nice as well, but it's not at the core. And fourthly, we do need youth organisations that continue to think critically about their own practices. Is our practice inclusive? Is it democratic? Is it non-bureaucratic? Do we listen to young people? Do we also listen to the frontline youth workers? And do we include both from their different perspectives in planning youth work and evaluation? So without a critical attention to the politics of youth work, of its practice, its funding, how it's evaluated, and the wider policy context that we're all living and often struggling with, we risk neglecting the wider, unequal, oppressive context in which young people and youth workers are living and in which practice with young people takes place. And we can't sit back and wait for change to occur. So we do need to discuss the dilemmas. It's amazing to be here together. And I think spending time as youth workers reflecting is in itself part of what we need to be doing to work for change. And working collectively to take a stand, visioning, transforming youth work, dreaming a better world. So I want to finish just with huge thanks to all the youth workers and youth organisations and young people who are part of the research, to my colleague Louise Doherty, who's a big part of thinking a lot of what I've been speaking today. And a big, huge thanks to YouthREX for hosting me, and thanks for listening. We ask people. So we've got this film that was made by young people, and it's about the value of youth work. It may give you a flavour of youth work in England. It's 10 minutes long, or we could just watch 2 minutes of it. What do you prefer? And then we'll have a discussion and questions. Should we watch it? Let's watch it, the whole 10 minutes. Okay. So they filmed it, they did all the sound, they did every aspect of it, they decided what was going to be in it, and they star in it. Yeah.
I come to youth club because it helps more with my social life and my mental health.
It's more fun than being at home a lot of the time.
I'd probably be sat at home right now watching my phone and just be lazy in my bed, which is not good for you.
If this wasn't here, it would probably be like quite boring. yeah, there's not much to do.
It teaches you new things a lot every day.
I've made loads of new friends and all that here.
Hang out with my friends and I can just get away from screens.
Because it gives me a place to go when I really can't deal with being anywhere else.
It's special to meet people, just to know that you can be friends with everyone without being judged.
If I didn't come here, I'd just be sat at home, bored, in the house, doing nothing, and probably getting in trouble.
It's helped me get through a rough stage in my life where I've been really sad, and just coming here makes me, feel free.
Rethinking Impact, Evaluation and Accountability in Youth Work is a 3-year qualitative research study funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Over the 3 years, the research has looked at investigating the youth impact agenda, if and how it's shaping practice, trying to understand the perspectives and experiences of young people, practitioners, managers, funders and policymakers in relation to the value of youth work and how youth work is evaluated, and thinking about and sharing approaches to evaluation and accountability that are appropriate to youth work practice. This short film is a way to share some of the research with you and to get you involved in thinking about what has been discovered. Let's start with showing you the value of youth work.
I come to youth club to escape home place, and to come to a place where I can laugh and just be myself and have fun with people and just kind of make a social life for myself instead of staying at home.
It improves my mental health with the groups, for example girls group and basketball.
We do loads of different activities, like get creative, and we do some girls groups and stuff like that.
I socialise quite a bit. I make new friends, and I go on a lot of activities, and I do different things where sometimes we'll be doing filming, or sometimes we'll be going out to different places.
On Friday night, you do cooking sometimes. Apple crumble, yeah, that was nice.
Youth club is
Fun to play with my friends.
And I have fun with friends.
I enjoy youth club because I can socialise with other people.
And the youth workers also support me.
The youth workers support me in difficult situations.
We love our youth centre! It's just a place where you're safe, and then the youth workers, they always keep you safe at all times.
And this is our area, we have our games and everything. We play football in here for our youth clubs on the inside, and then there's normally bits around, but there's none in here today. This is the main part, and then there's more bits where we do more. And then in here we'll have multiple activities. We'll have a food bit over there, and then over here we'll have an activity that everyone will do with it.
It's just nice to be out of the house, and it's also different activities, and it's nice to meet new people and new young people. It's also the youth workers, because they are quite kind and they're just like a family to me. We do activities that involve us saying what we want to do, and it's basically you just get to do what you want to do, and you're going to know what you're going to enjoy.
About how we could improve the area, what ideas we can put forward to the councils and things like that to help us improve our area.
So I live next to the youth space, so I'm going to show you what it's like around the area and all that. From my end, there isn't really nothing to do at all. If I didn't come to the youth club sessions, I would be bored at home, and I would be just watching my phone all the time. If say I don't like wandering around the streets, so I know I could come here a couple of times a night, have something to do and look forward for it, because I do enjoy coming to these sessions.
I come here because the community is great.
I come here to have fun and communicate with other people and make friends.
We have a fab lab when you come in on the right side and a kitchen on the left side.
So now as you walk through the main hall, this is our stage and we've got the sofas, the Xbox and the Wii up here. Here on our left, we have our chill out rooms where you can just come and have a sit down. We've got sofas and cool things and speakers and all of that good stuff. And in here is the studio, and this has got all of our music equipment. So in here we have a live room, and we also have a vocal booth and all of the technologies and computers as well.
This place is special because not only is there a very wide range of activities and like diverse people, there's also like the chance to get a bunch of different perspectives with everything.
I think it's a really good space where I know I won't be judged.
If I didn't come here, I'd probably just be on my phone, probably on TikTok.
The things I do when I'm not here are lying in bed with my pyjamas on and doing absolutely nothing.
It's quite nice because we've got a lot of like outside area, because obviously we have the beach and then we've got the mare, which is like a big grass area and things like that. So like the youth centre can actually go out and do things as well. So we'll have like barbecues or big like rounders matches and things. So it's quite nice having all the space around us.
Yeah, they're cute, Emmy. I like them.
We not only have fun, but we learn about stuff.
Right, so on this, what you're going to do is, for your survey that you want to send out to me.
The youth workers are very important because they have the skills and status of like teachers, but they have different priorities, and so they can focus a lot more on what you need. They're nice and you can like talk to them pretty much about anything.
Youth workers that make it just feel like home. You know you're safe when you're around the youth workers.
If you have a situation, you can go to them, but then it stays between you and them and it won't get spread to anyone else. And I think that's a lot better if it's like personal situations, you can actually speak to them and you know you can trust them.
Youth workers, they're like, you can talk to them whenever and they're really nice, and you can ask them questions which maybe you don't want to ask your parents, but if something's like dangerous or like you're being threatened, then they would tell someone who could help.
One size doesn't fit all. We all live in different areas and under different circumstances.
It's really not about just keeping us off the streets, but you know that, right?
Out of like 10, how important would you say this is to you?
10.
10.
10 out of 10. I think a 10 out of 10.
It's like a 10 for me.
10.
I'd say 10.
I mean, I might be a bit biased, but I'd say definitely a 10.
I think that it's very important. 10 out of 10.
Thank you so much, everyone. This will mark the end of our live stream for the morning. We're going to pause the live stream until around 12:20 this afternoon. So thank you to everyone online who is joining us, and we will see you in about an hour or so. For folks who are in the room, we have some time for some questions with Tania before we break for lunch.